All right, welcome back everyone to day 2 of the ArchivesSpace Basics training. Before we dive into today's agenda, we're going to spend a little bit of time going over your homework for today and addressing the questions that we got via the feedback form on your agenda. Nancy's going to quickly sort of show you, if you did do the exercises, show you what your results may have looked like. There's a lot of different ways to accomplish tasks in ArchivesSpace. So if you don't do it exactly like Nancy did it, that's okay. And then we're going to answer the questions that were submitted via the feedback form. And then if you have a question that you didn't get a chance to submit and would like to have answered the first 30 minutes or so, go ahead and submit that through the Q&A feature now, and I'll make sure that those questions get addressed too. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Nancy to give us a little bit of a homework recap before we answer those questions. Nancy?
Can you see my ASpace screen? Is it sharing properly?
It's very small. I mostly just see your desktop. There we go.
There we go. Is that better? All right. I didn't have the green bar around it, so I wasn't sure there for a second. So what we're going to do first is, if you guys did choose to do the workbook assignments, you would have used the first description sample to first create an accession record and then spawn that to create a resource record. And you would have stopped sort of before getting to the series. We're going to cover this kind of content today. And then you would have fleshed out those records with the data in this first descriptive sample. If you chose not to use the first descriptive sample, perhaps you used some of your own data and did something similar. What I'm going to pull up is a demo database, in which is a little bit of a cheat sheet of some of the answers. You won't have these records in your own test instances, but I'm just going to walk through them quickly here. So for example, the first accession record in this descriptive sample, the Stump Family Business and Personal Papers, it had an accession number, its accession date, a source, a volume of materials, some description, some intellectual property rights, indication that a store ledger is falling apart from years of use, and a certain amount of processing information. And if you notice in the second paragraph, there's an indication that some of the material was returned to the donor. Now, we didn't cover the accession records in our overview of accessions. We don't usually, but this was a place for you guys to potentially go through and experiment with the system and see what you might do with that. So here's sort of a cheat sheet of that. I'm going to browse to our accessions. And I'm going to find, here's the Stump Business and Personal Papers. And I'm going to go ahead and just pull this up in view mode and show an example of how this was filled in. So here's our title for our accession. This was our accession number, the accession date. And of course, when this record was initially created, as usually happens, it would have tried to fill in with today's date, and you would have had to change it to reflect the original accession date. The content description is one of those fields that, again, if you spawn it to a resource record, will come over as a scope and content note. So it's sort of a summary. Condition description comes over to the resource record as a physical description note. So this is the place where some of these indications of need for conservation work or other special housing might go into place. We use the provenance statement. This does not translate over if you spawn the record to a resource. It was a gift, it was papers. There were some restrictions because the copyright was transferred, but some of these are fragile and have to be used under close supervision. The dates were filled in. When you're in view mode, if something is filled in, if you want to see a little bit more detail about what it is, you'd click the down caret and you could see the begin end dates if it's tagged as inclusive or bulk or other things. The extents work the same way. If you wanted to see more detail, if some of those container summary, for example, is filled in 3 record cartons, that's the way to view it. We'll get to the agent links next Tuesday in our 3rd session. And because this one did end up getting spawned to a resource, you can see the link to that resource record in here. They actually filled in, they were playing around and expanding and using some of the other fields that were available. So they used the right statement to indicate the copyright was transferred with some notes. Again, this is not something we have time to go into in the basics, but it's an example of how one might fill it out. And the deaccessions. This is material that was documented as being removed with the deaccession date and the extent. And on the up caret, they chose to use classifications. And this is, I think, a record that's also used for some other trainings for assessments. So this is far beyond anything that you would have been asked to fill in, but it's what it would look like if it were filled in. And I don't know if anybody has questions about if they did something differently, feel free to jump in. I'm going to jump over quickly to the resource record that would have been spawned from this, and that could have been fleshed out given the information in that first description sample. So again, I'm going to browse. I could browse from resources, but I could also actually come down and click on where it's blue in related resources. If I click on that, if I left click on it, I get a view, and I can then open it up from that location. So this actually opens up the resource that is linked to that accession and that was spawned from it in accordance with the homework instructions. So in this case, the accession number is different. Might be the same. It became the identifier number, the accession number became the identifier number. Language, of course, had to be filled in. And notice it did open it up in view mode. You can tell it's in view mode because number one, you don't see all of the other fields that you could have filled in. You can see up here that this is grayed out and this is in view. If we want to edit it, we could open it in edit mode. And you can see the breadcrumbs up here change. And the grayed out one is where we are. We're in edit. If I wanted to click back to view, I could simply click back on the breadcrumbs. So scrolling down, we have notes and the dates came over, the extents. I noticed in this case, it was 3 boxes and this has been fleshed out a little bit more than it was in the accession record. The finding aid data would have all had to be edited, entered from scratch because none of that comes over in the spawning process. Now the related accession, this is what it came from because it was spawned, it automatically filled in. But as we showed yesterday, you can always add more manually if you need to. Again, we're going to skip over agent links and subjects for now. And then these are the notes. The scope and content note would have come over initially and then been enhanced based on the data. The biographical historical note, again, this was not in the accession record. There was really no way to bring it over if it had been. So this would have had to have been filled in from scratch. And then it has an arrangement note. We're going to get into fleshing out the series in a few minutes. Source of acquisition, and this was this did not spawn over, but had to be fleshed out from the donation information. The access and use notes also were in the original accession, but did not spawn and had to be rebuilt over here. And again, we'll sort of skip over classifications and assessments for now. So that was the top record that was spawned. Are there questions at this point?
Thanks, Nancy. There was a question about publishing an accession record. Someone says, I put donated by Jim Stump Wayward in provenance, but couldn't figure out how to make it not show. Noah went ahead and answered that one in the text, but I'm going to read his response. I think the provenance field in accession records will display unless you unpublish the entire accession record by unchecking the publish checkbox towards the bottom of the basic info section. So that is correct.
Yeah.
So is there anything else you want to show, Nancy, before we just dive into questions? I want to ask that before, because we are getting some questions in the Q&A.
Just to back up what Noah said, if you notice, there's only one publish box for all of this top level information. And I believe it actually carries throughout the entire, I think it's the only published box in the thing. So I think that it really is an all or nothing. With the resource records, there are published boxes all over the place. So you do have more control over what you do and don't send to the PUI.
Just to add a kind of another point to that, if you and your institution decide that you don't want to publish any accession records like ever, you can turn off accession records from appearing in the public UI, public user interface, even if you, regardless of whether or not you check that publish box. So that's like a configuration option that you can make like system-wide.
Yeah. Okay, I will stop sharing unless there are other questions about this stump accession record and other and resource record.
You may want to go ahead and keep your screen up while we go through, in case there's something you want to show. Would you like for me to go ahead and go to the pre-submitted questions, or are we ready for those?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, we'll go ahead and do those first. Let me switch over. Well, I guess maybe Noah's going to be sharing his screen. So the first question we got via the submission form. So do remember there is a submission form on your agenda. If you have questions about your homework that you'd like to ask in advance, we're going to ask the questions that were submitted in advance first, and then we'll move over to the Q&A. Is there a way to change the order in which fields display when browsing collections? For example, could the identifier column be put before the title column?
Yeah, I can take that. You all can see my screen?
Yep.
Great. Okay. Yeah, this is something that we'll cover in a little bit more detail on day 4, but just to answer this specific question, I think what they're asking is if you go to browse resources, you'll see that there's a certain column order, that's the default setting throughout ArchivesSpace. This applies to any browse, if you browse accessions or browse resources. But let's say we wanted to do what the question asked, we wanted to put the identifier column here, like before the title column in our browse display. The way you do that is if you go up here to the top right, and you go to this drop down next to your username, there are these 3 preference options. We'll talk about how these are different next Thursday, but if I just click repository preferences for now, in this area in the application, you can configure a lot of different sorts of preferences. But one of the things you can do, if I scroll down, is you can configure your search and browse column preferences. So if we were to go down to resource records, somewhere down here, resource browse columns, right now you can see like what the default is, but if we wanted to move identifier to column 1, we could just choose identifier and then switch this one, column 2, to title. And then if we save these preferences, then we go back to browse resources, we'll see that like we move the identifier column over. Just to point out while we're here, like when we're modifying the column order in the browse screens, they only apply to the record type, that you configured. And so if I did a general search, you're not going to see the same order that you set in the browse preferences. But yeah, that's how you would do that. That's something like we've definitely done. We have a preferred, order. You can also add columns that don't appear by default, which is a nice feature. There might be some bit of data that you want to show up that doesn't show up by default. You're sort of limited though in the screen real estate as to how many columns you add. Is there another question?
Yep. So why are the finding aid fields in one order in the online interface, but in a different order in the PDF version? The order in the PDF version was how I thought the fields would display after moving them around a bit.
Yeah, I think there are a few different things going on here. If we look at an example, maybe we can point out what you're talking about. So if I went to look at that Krispy Kreme records, you can see in the staff interface, at least, there's a sort of a prescribed order for like these basic fields. But then if you go down to the note area, you'll see some note fields, and you do within the staff interface in any given resource record, you can move these around however you want. But it does, if you do that, it does not really affect the order that these note fields are going to show up in if we look at the public interface. So if I click View Published, I'm gonna open that in another tab. You'll see that like the order that fields show up in the public interface is fixed. It's based on like a configuration. And so I'm not seeing the note fields here. I think those notes might be unpublished, but the notes would show up in a specific order. Like it looks like the restriction information shows up before biographical, but if I go back here, you'll see that that's not true. Like the restriction stuff is at the very end in the staff interface. And then similarly, if I were to export the PDF of this record, I already did that just to save time. You'll see that it's in yet another order. And this is because the sort of style sheet that controls the display of the PDFs, the way the data is output in the PDF, it's kind of hard coded to a particular order. So if you wanted to modify the style sheet to move fields around or otherwise change what the PDFs look like, you can do that. But that's not something that you can do simply by moving things around in the staff interface. You sort of have to get under the hood and change those settings. So hopefully that helped clarify that question. Yeah.
All right, and then we had one more pre-submitted question. I think Nancy's going to take this one. Does it make a difference if I split the identifier into multiple parts or keep the full number in one box? Does it change the search behavior to do it one way or the other?
Sorry, I was muted. We saw that question come through, so I went in to our instructor's test bed, and I spawned a accession from another accession and entered the same identifier in a different way. Now, of course, this is only possible, so there are a couple ramifications of whether you field them or not. So number one, even though these two numbers are essentially the same thing, the system believes they're different because one is fielded and one is not, so it treats them as different numbers. So the first consideration in how you choose to do it is to be consistent, because if you are inconsistent, you could run the risk of having a duplicate number in the system, and it won't tell you because it doesn't know that. So that's the first thing, is be consistent in what you choose. In this case, the one that has the dash happens to be the fielded version. The one with the period is something I hard typed the period in, and it's all in one field. As you sort in either direction, the fielded ones will always list first. The unfielded ones will list second. The advantages and disadvantages of fielding or not come into play a little bit more when you're, say, trying to run a SQL query against the data in here, or running an outside report generator. In some respects, it can be easier to sort and filter and limit if the fields are limited, if you break them out across the fields. But on the other hand, getting the fielded number to display as a string is a bit of a pain, because it comes back with quotation marks around it and all sorts of things. So when I run background reports against it, my own custom reports, I have a little script that has to convert the fielded numbers into something that looks like a pretty string. The system already makes it look like a pretty string here, but it doesn't dump out that way. So there are advantages and disadvantages to doing both. Either way, and you just need to be consistent in what you choose. I don't know that there's a right or a wrong answer. Does that help?
Thanks, Nancy. All right, we're going to go ahead and move into the Q&A questions that we got. All right, we have a multi-part question, so I'm going to ask it as 2 questions. Nancy, can you maybe give an example of or explain what access restrictions are, what one would be?
So there are 2 kinds of, I'm going to open up Noah's from yesterday, because I think we filled. So the access restrictions and use restrictions. The access restrictions are fundamentally about, can a researcher get to it? Are you allowed to access it at all? And then use restrictions are more about, if you access it, what can you then do with it? So it would be, access restrictions might be certain records are closed until the death of the donor. Use restrictions, again, would be about copyright, ability to photocopy, you know, and then if you're in EAD, you'd have a 3rd restriction note would be technical or technical note. Well, there's like it's not so much a restriction note, but there's like a technical requirements, and it might be that you need a certain piece of software to access something. So does that help?
Thanks, Nancy. All right, I'm going to go ahead and before I answer the next part, so I'm getting some questions about how to access the test instances. I will drop a link into the chat to the workshop machine assignments. Everyone has their own test instance of ArchivesSpace that they should be using for their homework if they're not using their organization's instance. So everyone's is individual, so you need to make sure you're locating your instance by your last name and accessing your link. So everyone has a unique test instance that they should be using, and Nancy's opening it up right there. So in your Google Drive, it's going to be workshop machine assignments. There it is. And they're all listed by alphabetically by last name. So I'll drop a link into the chat for those in just a second. But the next question in that 2-part question, Nancy, was where does the EAD ID number come from?
That is something that you would need to construct. I think the idea is that it would be uniquely identifying for both your finding aid and your institution. It's actually described more thoroughly what it should be, I believe, in the, let me go, bear with me. I'm going to jump back over to a resource. Come on, stop. And browse resources. I'm going to open one up. If you actually look at the EAD tag library, that would be where you show up. Oh, sorry, I should be in edit because this one doesn't have one. But the need for it and how you might construct it should be in the EAD tag library itself, although there's probably a rollover, which is what I'm trying to get to, that would indicate. It can be a file name. Oftentimes we use this, especially if we're sharing with consortial repositories to help identify both our institution and our finding aid. But it could be a file name. It could be something you construct. At home, we include our MARC agency code in that.
All right, thanks, Nancy. One final question. We only have 2 minutes, and I know we're going to be tight for time today. Could you clarify the terms that you used when you were talking about the identifier fields earlier? I think one of the terms you used was fielded, and then they said I didn't catch the other, but maybe could you explain what you mean by fielded?
By fielded, this one is fielded. So all of these elements, these are individual elements of this identifier. It's a complex identifier. So another sort of complex identifier might be if it were an accession number, and part of the accession number included the year, and then maybe the other part of the accession number included the consecutive number of the accession. So it might be year 2020, accession number 10. And so you could enter that in an unfielded way. It's simply all as a string. In the first identifier, you could say 2020 period, or whatever you wanted the breakpoint to be, the consecutive number, or you could field it out across multiple fields to say 2020 here and 002. In this case, the identifier was the repository, and then FA for finding aid, and then the finding aid number. So fielded would mean that it's broken out across multiple fields. To enter it as a single string, or in an unfielded way would just be to put all of the data in the first box with some kind of manual breakpoint between things potentially. You could do I'm just using a period, you could do something else. So this would be an unfielded number, and this is fielded.
All right. Sarah says, got it, thanks. All right, so that's everything in the Q&A, Nancy. So it's very convenient that you have your screen shared right now, since you're going to kick us off with today's instruction. So before our break, we're going to be covering how to create multi-level resource records and managing instances in top containers. So Nancy, I'm going to go ahead and turn that over to you.
Okay. So, yesterday we're going to continue talking about resource records. We started it yesterday with the main level, and pointed out, I've got to change my screen slightly because the things bury my tabs, and then I can't navigate, so I apologize. Bear with me 1 second, because the Zoom thing covers my tabs, and then I can't navigate. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of the machine assignments. And so I'm going to come back over and again give you sort of a view of where we're going. So this was the Krispy Kreme record that I dumped out yesterday, the finding aid. And yesterday we discussed, how you sort of start to build out this top level. And today we're going to start getting into the actual collection inventory and build out the intellectual and descriptive information for the actual details of the content in a collection. So this is one example of it. This is one that's a pretty straight box list, and it doesn't have a lot of description. It has some hierarchy in it. It has administrative records that are broken down into correspondence, executive, and some others. Now, here's another example of a finding aid that has a little bit more description in it. So for example, this is actually in your test instances. It's just in the space repository. And so you can see, if you want to look at an example that's a little bit more fleshed out there, you can flip over. This one has some hierarchy and some additional notes. You can add notes and as much descriptive information to any level of the hierarchy as you can to the main level. So we're going to discuss all of this. First, we're going to build out the intellectual hierarchy, and then we're going to talk about instances and top containers. Now, I'll say this, I'm breaking it out this way in terms of instruction to just introduce concepts one at a time. If I were actually processing, I would probably be entering instances, that is like the box and folder numbers, at the same time that I was doing the description. Once once ArchivesSpace version 3 comes out, I believe there's going to be, for the first time, a spreadsheet importer that would allow you to enter boxes and folders after the fact. With this version, if you don't do it at the same time, you're going to have to go back into every component and add them separately later, which would be rather time consuming. But again, for instructional purposes here, I'm going to do them one after the other. So I hope that makes sense. So this is where we're going. We're going to add this description stuff to the bottom of the core of the main descriptive record. So I'm going to bounce back over. Here's our resource. And this is the record I spawned from an accession yesterday. It was one of one that I had one accession and I spawned multiple records from it. This happens to be one of them. And so we're going to go into this one and we're going to start to flesh things out. And I'll show you a few things you can do as you start working with this. Now, once we saved this main record yesterday, a few options appeared at the top. We're going to talk, Noah's going to talk about load via spreadsheet and rapid data entry after our break. So I'm going to ignore those for now. It's a much more expeditious way of getting the data into the system. So it's a faster way of doing what I'm about to show you. We're going to get to enable reorder mode in a moment, but we're going to start with add child. Now, remember, as I said yesterday, we were looking at that Krispy Kreme record, that at this point, we're entering intellectual hierarchy. And that's really what the system is sort of intended to do. There are other ways of doing it, and I've seen them, and there are other ways of getting it to work, but I'm going to show you this as the way that the system's kind of fundamentally intended to work. So in this case, I'm going to add a child, and it automatically shows up with a new archival object, and that's just sort of a temporary title. When you save the record, there are only, if you recall from yesterday, there were multiple required fields at the top level. That is not the case with the components. At the component level, there are only really 2 required fields. The only absolute requirement is the level of description. You have to tell it what its intellectual level of hierarchy is. In this case, I'm going to call it a series. The other required field is either a title, or you see this gray asterisk here, it's very hard to see, but there is one, or a date. So this is the conditionally required, so you have to have one or the other in order to save the record. So I'm going to say, well, I'm in my art holding company governance records, and I'm going to say this series is board records. And I could stop here. In this case, I could have a title and a date, and I could say that my board record series is from 1917 to 1990, and these are inclusive. I could choose to fill in the beginner end dates. Just in the interest of time, I'm not going to. I could add extents. The amount of description that you do for your series, your sub-series, etc., is an institutional choice. It depends on what you want to do in conformance with DAX, but it's also an institutional choice. So for example, and again, bouncing back over to these 2 finding aids, this one doesn't have much. It has a little bit of dates, but that's about it. This particular finding aid has, at the series level, quite a bit more. Has arrangement statement, scope, contents note. Every note that is available at the top level can be added at a series or sub-series or component or file, any level. You can add all of the same notes. So if I wanted to add a scope and content note to this one, I could do that. I would scroll down, I would find scope and contents. I could, let's say if I wanted, again, if I didn't want it to say scope and contents, let's say I wanted it to say administrative history. I would type this in and the label would trump in its display the scope and content note type. And then I could say this. I cannot type. And I could, so forth and so on. And then I can save this, or now I have an option of +1. So if I hit the +1, I save it and I open up another parallel child. So I'm going to hit the +1. And it saved my board records as series. And I now have a new archival object. And let's say for my governance records, I have a second series. And that one's going to be my, oh, let's say legal files. And that's all I'm going to say about that one. Just again, in the interest of time, I could add dates. I could add as much description as I wanted to. But I'm just going to hit save. And now I have 2 series. And let's say I want to start building out information under these series. So if now you can see that I have an add sibling. I could add sibling if I wanted to add another parallel series at the same level of hierarchy, or I can start adding children. Whatever is highlighted here will be the actionable body for one of these links. So if this is highlighted and I add a child, it will be a child of board records. If I add a sibling, it will be a sibling of board records. If I were to click again on the top level, notice add sibling is gone because you can't have a sibling of the top level, and any child would be a child of the top level. So I'm going to click back to board records. I'm going to say add child. And again, it doesn't know what kind of child it is. It doesn't care. So I'm going to say this is going to be a subseries. And in this case, it's going to be meeting material. And I'm going to save and +1. And it might be, there's the next one. This might also be a subseries. And we'll pretend that's spelled correctly just for the heck of it. And subseries, and save that. I could, and notice where my cursor is, where these little gray bars are, if I want to make this bigger or smaller, I can drag that. Under legal files, if I want to add a child, let's just say I have bylaws. And that's let's just say that's a file. And I could save that. And I could click on bylaws, and I could add a sibling. And this might be original charter, and maybe that is also a file. In the background, in the data behind the scenes, these are being numbered with the EAD tags. So they're being tagged as components. But again, the system is not declaring what kind of, you have to tell the system what kind of component it is at what level, as opposed to the system necessarily assuming that this is a fixed hierarchy. So you could have art holding company records, and it could be a straight box list underneath it with no hierarchy at all, and that's fine. You would just simply declare if they were files as opposed to some larger descriptive element. So it's very flexible, and you can build it out as you need. So for example, under meeting material, if I have child, I'm going to say minutes. And this could be a second level of subseries, +1. And this could be subseries. Now under my minutes, I could start saying something like add child. And instead of filling in the title, I'm going to say this is a file. And these are the minutes from 15th, 1988. And it's a single date. I could fill in the 1988-12-15 if I wished, and I could save that. And this is why you can, a component record can be saved with either a title or a date or both, because you don't want to necessarily, it's not necessarily good description to repeat minutes every single time. If now my list of minutes is going to start becoming rather long, potentially they could have started in 1917 and run clear through, the repetition of minutes would be a bit painful to read. So it's again assuming hierarchy here. So if I add a child, a sibling, I could say also a file, and oops, the date. This is going to be required, +1, and file, date, and September, oh, let's say 30th, 1990. Are there questions at this point? Does this, I'm sorry, single. Does this make sense in terms of how one builds out the hierarchy to start with?
Nancy?
Yep.
We did get a request. Could you explain the family relationship again, that child-sibling relationship, what that means?
So this is basically, again, adding a next level of hierarchy. So is it going to be at a child level of something, or is it going to be a sibling or a parallel level of something? It doesn't matter what that level of hierarchy is. You can sort of change it, and I'll show you in a minute how you could actually rearrange things. But this is almost like a coding language. So again, is it a child in the hierarchy, or is it something parallel? Does that help? So these three here are parallel. Minutes and scheduling records are parallel, so they are siblings. Under meeting material has two children, minutes and scheduling records. Minutes has children of these three meeting minute files.
Thanks, Nancy. And then I understand the save button, but what is the +1 button next to it?
The +1 is to save the current record and initiate a new record simultaneously. So when I did that, if I enter 1 and then just, let me do one more. If I, there we go. So if I add a sibling, I get this new archival object and another meeting, and it's also a file. If I were to just save it, it would close this, save it, it would close this, and to add another record, I would have to go back up to the top and click on child or sibling again. If I just hit the +1, it saves this one and automatically opens a new record at the same level. So it would be it made my another meeting, and then it created an opportunity to make yet another file right after it.
And to clarify, that file would be at the same level as the file that you saved in +1. It would not be a child of that file, correct?
Exactly. It would be parallel, it would be a sibling.
So could I add a parent after the fact?
Yes, you could add a parent, or you could even move things around. So in order to add a parent after the fact, what you would do would be you'd have to say, go to say minutes, create a sibling to that, and then you could move this archival object underneath it. And actually, let me show you. Let's change it. I don't want to keep that other one. So for example, you can do this to do a number of different things. I'm going to move some of these, and I'm going to hit enable reorder mode. And once I hit this, the ability to edit any of these will go away. So whatever I have highlighted, you're not going to be able to edit this. This was done to help improve performance issues. But let's say I want my legal files to actually appear in front of the board records. If you see over here on the far left, there's a bunch of little dots. Oh, and my cursor becomes a 4-way arrow when I go over the top of them. If I click on this, I can drag it. And right now, when I drag it up, it's hovering, the one I'm hovering over becomes green. And if I unclick, so what I did, let me do that again. I clicked on it, I held down my left click, and I drug it up to kind of where I wanted it to go. I released the click, and then I get the option, do I want to add it before, after that, or as a child of that? I'm going to say before. And so now I've rearranged these. If I wanted to do something else, so let's say I want to grab, another thing you can do is you can grab multiple, but let me show you this first. If I grab legal files, once it's clicked, the other option is move, and move up or move down into, not sure why it wants me to, oh. It didn't actually do too much that time, but if I were to move trustee correspondence or click on this, move up a level, down into, I can move it up a level, and that made it parallel with board records as opposed to being underneath board records. I could then move it back, add it as a child, and it puts it, you can see it dropped over a little bit. You can see these squares sort of showing you where it is in the hierarchy, and it moves it back. So you can move all sorts of things around this way. And so if you end up where you're altering your hierarchy, after say you started processing and you realize that the hierarchy that you planned on isn't going to quite work and you need to change it, this is how you could move things around. I'm going to move this. Come on. Oh. Moved it more than I thought I did. There we go. Moved it up. So that put it back a little bit. So this is one way that you can move and rearrange things even when they're in there. Does that help answer the question?
Thanks, Nancy. So
out of this, you disable reorder mode, and that will click that button and it will take you back to the edit screens.
they said, yes, thank you.
Okay.
We've gotten through all of, so I asked some clarifying questions that came up in the Q&A, but there were other questions that were asked, and Noah has been answering those in more detail in text. So if you are not following along in the answered Q&A, I definitely recommend checking there for answers to some of the more in-depth questions. One of the questions that Noah did answer in some detail, but I think it might be worth pointing out, Nancy, could you talk a little bit about why you might choose to use the normalized dates versus the date expression?
Date expression is sometimes a little bit more human readable, but if you're going to, if like in the PUI, there's some, I think, searchability that it likes the more machine readable begin and end dates. And so those can have more use again for sorting, filtering that can be a little bit more specific. But again, it's the difference between machine readable and sometimes human readable, and they both have advantages. There's certainly nothing wrong with filling in both. Where I am, we developed some scripts using the API and whatnot, and we didn't have normalized dates, but we're moving into a display system that is really going to benefit from them. So we're actually going into the API and adding normalized dates to everything. Finding it by finding it's a little slow, but we're getting it done. So there are advantages, but for example, I usually have this dump out in the finding aid as opposed to, you know, the more detailed date here. But practice varies considerably, and part of it comes down to what is it that you want to do with that data, and is it worth it to you to take the time to fill it in both places. And again, because it's a date expression, actually it doesn't have to be both places. You could do the expression and or the begin and end dates. So you could choose not to fill in the expression. You would still need the label and the type, and then you could simply fill in the begin and end dates. So then it really comes down to not just how you want it to display in the PUI and in the PDF, but do you have additional uses for that data in other ways? Other searching you want to do on it, other sorting and filtering? Are you contributing to a consortial repository that can make use of begin and end dates? And Noah may have thoughts on this too.
Yeah, I think you covered it. I just dropped into the chat a link to like a plugin that we don't have time to cover in the workshop, but there's a plugin available that if you have permissions to install it in your instance, it will automatically derive normalized dates, so begin and end dates from a date expression. So like the example that Nancy has on the screen, if she were to save this record, it would automatically drop 1917 into begin and 1990 into the end field. It's really handy. It's able to parse like 90% of dates, at least in my experience. But I'm happy to talk more about that, like if we have time at the end today or another session.
I think it's time walk, isn't it? Yeah.
It's time walk. And there we have a webinar where Alex actually presented on that, and I'll go in a second and I'll find a link to that webinar. So if you're interested specifically in how that works, I'll drop that into the chat. Someone did ask, and it's a question that kind of brings up some things about ArchivesSpace, so it might be worth answering really quickly. Do we plan to make the time walk plugin core code? So if there is ever interest in a new feature, like making a plugin core code, or if there's something that ArchivesSpace doesn't do and there isn't a plugin for it and you wish ArchivesSpace did it, ArchivesSpace is a community supported and developed software. So if there's ever anything that you're interested in seeing ArchivesSpace do, our development catalog is public and you can just submit a ticket. Or if you find a bug, please do submit a ticket. You can also search to see if that request has already been made before and add your support. So I'll drop a link to that in the chat as well, so you can check out what's there. We also have a roadmap, so you can see what the ArchivesSpace team is currently working on and what's sort of in the nearer future than everything that's in the development catalog, because there's quite a bit. But I think that actually covers, let's see, there's one Q&A. And someone is talking about the calendar, that there's a lot of nuances available in ArchivesSpace. That is true. But I think that catches us up in the Q&A, Nancy. So if you want to keep going, and I'll drop those links into the chat now.
So I'm going to go ahead and move on to discussing instances and top containers. And I find that usually this is one of the parts that when we're teaching this workshop that people find the most confusing. And it's not because they don't fundamentally, as they come to realize, they understand what this is. They already know what this is. They've just frequently never heard these terms and this nomenclature assigned to it. So bear with me if I just try and rip some of the language out and use very simplistic terms. It's not trying to talk down to anybody. It's just trying to cut through some of the jargon. And again, where I want to start is fundamentally what we're doing. So what we're talking about in the most simplistic terms are adding box and folder information. We have this descriptive information and this hierarchy saying, here's what our collection is, and we're describing that. And so now we're going to take the step of, so if I wanted to pull it for the reading room, what do I grab? And so that's what we're going to start building in. So here's one example. And again, if we go over to this, oops, I just made it big. I don't know what I just did. Anyway, bear with me, screen problems. So here's my other example. And this is a case where we just have boxes and no folders. And here's another case of boxes.
Hey, Nancy, we've lost your screen.
Oh.
At least I have.
If you did, probably everybody did. I don't know what I hit. Is that better?
Yep, it's back.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the heads up. So again, here's another case. So in each case of these, we're gonna stop and think about it for a second. You have a bunch of stuff and your papers, photographs, whatever it is, you have a bunch of stuff, and you're probably putting it in folders, and those folders are probably living in boxes, and your box is probably living on a shelf someplace. And somebody's going to request the box, and you're going to pull that for the reading room. And then at somebody's desk, you might allow them to pull one folder out of the box at a time. And again, this is the most simplistic possible scenario. I know there are myriad permutations of this. So what you have probably someplace is this is a single box one. In this collection, there is box one, and it is referenced multiple times across the finding aid. In each case, this is the same box that's being referenced. this particular this particular content happens to be in folder 4 in this overarching box. You probably also someplace have a spreadsheet or a database that says box 1 lives on this shelf. So if you need to go to it, that's where you go. Now, you don't have box 1 listed in that spreadsheet or database 20 times. You have it listed once, and it's only once in that database because you just need to reference it once there. So in a sense, again, ArchivesSpace is this slightly more expansive database. So what we're going to do is build box 1 a single time. We're going to show that it has an ability to link to a location, but we're not actually going to do that until day 4, which is next Thursday, and we'll show you how to build locations and associate boxes with them. But this box 1 is going to live once in the system. It can be reused multiple times within the finding aid, and it contains that one reference point to the location. It could also potentially be shared with other collections, because there are, a lot of us have scenarios where we have very small accessions or collections of things, and they might share a box, just in interest of space and keeping our supply budget down. So I can show you, again, that you can actually use boxes across collections, and the system knows how to keep track of these things. So this is where we're going, and I hope that kind of makes sense, because now we're going to flip back over and show you how to actually construct this in ArchivesSpace. So if I come back over, and I'm going to drill down, and we have our minutes, and these are files. And so let's say I want to associate my box and folder information with, so if I want to pull the December 15th, 1988 minutes for someone in a reading room, what do I need to pull off a shelf? So if I click on it, and then this opens the record, if I come down, this is where we're talking about instances. So as I click on it, come down, I see instances. I have 2 options, add container instance and add a digital object. What this is really saying is, I could have, and I'm going to give you an example of a minute in which both of these might apply. But in a sense, what I'm saying is the instance that I'm going to add, is this a physical thing that I can pick up and throw? In which case you're going to add a container instance. I'm not recommending you actually throw anything, but it's like just as a conceptual thing, if you can pick it up and throw it, it's a physical container instance. If you need a mouse, a computer, a server to serve it up and access its software, then it's a digital object. And there can be scenarios where both apply. So if I add a container instance, because this set of minutes is something I could hurl across the room, I just click on it and I get the following screen. Now I always have to declare a type. These are based on mark leader fields, and so you can pick whatever is appropriate. I'm going to pick mixed materials. This is actually required, even though a mark record can only be generated from a top level resource record. This is required all the way down at every component level. So just be aware of that. The top container is basically going to be your box. Your child type is kind of going to be your folder. The reason the words box and folder are not used is because as I indicated a second ago, box and folder is one of many possible storage permutations. The idea is more that the top container would be whatever it is that you're going to pull off and serve in the reading room. The child could be a folder within it. It could be, an item within it, or we could have a folder as a child and an item as a grandchild. So if you had numbered letters in a folder, you could say box 10, folder 6, item 4. So it's using generic terms to cover the widest possible ground and usage. If this had been titled box and folder and item, then people would come along and say, okay, but where do I put my reel and my frame number? So that's why this language is the way it is. At this point, we're just assigning its physical material that we want to, say this is actually where you're going to find it in this box, and then ultimately this box will live on the shelf. But we needed a more generic term to cover all of the range of permutations. So let's go ahead and build this, in our case, what's going to be a box number. And note it is required. If you're, we're going to get to the type ahead option here in a second, but to build a new one, you click this down arrow and you go to create. And again, we're doing it this way because ultimately we're going to be able to assign this to a location. And once it's created, we can use it multiple times in the system. If we wanted to declare how big the box was, we could assign a container profile if we had one built. But in this case, I'm going to say box. Clearly, there are other options, and we're going to get to those in a second. So I'm box. This is the type, so you don't actually have to repeat box in the indicator. The indicator is really just for the number. So in this case, let's say my scenario here is I have all these minutes potentially starting in 1917, even though I haven't built all of that out. So this might be box, let's say 20, because I'm now in 1998 minutes, so maybe it's box 20. If I had a barcode for the box, I could enter it. If I had an ILS holding ID, I could enter that. But this is all I need to do, and I just hit create and link to top container. So this is now in box 20, and let's say this particular meeting material are in folders. And again, the indicator, the type is up here. The indicator is just the value. And so this might be in folders 2 through 5. And again, if I had items, I could do that. So at this point, I just save the object. And now I have, if I want to actually see the minutes that are described here, I would go to box 20 and look at folders 2 through 5. So let's say we go to March 15th. We're going to do something very similar. I'm going to go back to instances. I'm going to add a container instance. It will be mixed materials in this particular case. And now this is, say, next to it in the box. So I can just, in the type ahead, put my cursor here, I can just type 20. And it knows it exists, and I can repurpose it. The system is smart enough to know that box 20 in this finding aid is not the same as box 20 in another finding aid. In the background, this has a unique box identifier number that is associated with this finding aid. So the system knows the distinctions. So you don't have to worry about that. All of your collections are going to have a box 1. The system knows which box 1 goes with each collection. So in this case, my folder, before it was 2 through 5, maybe this time it's going to be 6 and 7. And I'm going to save this. And I have that. I'm going to go back into this same record because let's say I have a slightly different scenario. In this case, let's say this particular set of minutes had some oversized material in it. So some of this is in a regular box and folder. Let's say potentially this is a Hollinger. But what if I had some oversized material that I had to unfold and put into a flat file? So this is why there is the possibility, if you see down here, of adding a second container instance or a digital object. So if I add another container instance, I could say that this, maybe it's, maps, maybe it's a graphic material. And so there's a map because they were buying a piece of property or something. And I could say, I need a new top container, create. And in this case, it's going to be a flat file. And the indicator might be 12. Create and link to top container. Save the object. And so now to pull back the entirety of the records for March 15th, that meeting, I've got 2 folders in, say, a Hollinger box and material in 12. So to pull back all of it, I would have to pull back both. So for another meeting, we'll do something similar and scroll down, instances. I have to add a container instance. Maybe at this point, I'm now in materials. I'm going to create, and I need box 21 because I'm in a new Hollinger box now. So I can do this. And let's say this was back in the 1990s. And of course, this was maybe in a period where people were microfilming everything that wasn't literally tied down. So I have box 21. Maybe this is a big set of minutes and it's actually all the folders. So I'm just going to say that it's box 21, but it was also microfilmed. And so I could say that this is microform. And I could say I have a create container type as a real, and it's real 125, or boy, I mistyped that one. Well, we'll leave it at 153, what the heck. And in this case, I might have frames, and frames 100 through 5, 6. Because again, this is, in this case, I could, if I wanted to, do this a different way. I could say for this particular meeting, I could say, this is the original records are here. Maybe they're the signed version. I could have a child of it. So they said, here's the microform copy of it. But in this case, I'm just going to say, these are basically, this is all the same stuff. We could do this. Another potential option, I'm going to go to instances for this 1990. And let's say I'm adding container instance. And for the 1990 minute, we found a floppy disk with it. Now, a floppy disk is something that you can pick up and throw across the room. Again, not that I'm recommending that you do that, but you could. So the floppy disk is a physical instance. The content on the floppy disk, if harvested off and put on a server, would be a digital object. So in this case, I'm going to have mixed materials. I'm just going to say this is also in box 21. And it's going to be folders 1 through 3. And I have a container instance for computer disks. And let's say in this case, I don't have a lot of computer disks, and I have a shared box for computer disks with numbered items in there. So to find this, I would go to Browse. And I built one out earlier. And there are a variety of ways that you can browse for other containers in the system. When you search for these, you'll be bringing up things that are almost by definition in other records so that you could potentially share them. And so I've typed in floppy because I happen to know that I titled my box floppy disk box. And if I scroll down, there's a search button. If I hit search, if I had 10 floppy disk boxes, that would bring them all back. Let's say I have one that's associated with my Krispy Kreme records, but I want it to share with this one because all the floppy disks are going in this one box. And I'd link to top containers. And now this is associated, and I could say, in this particular case, it's item 25. So again, if you can pick it up and throw it, it's a physical instance, and you would use this kind of top container. And for electronic records, the carrier would be the physical instance. The content on it, if harvested off, would be a digital object. Hope that makes sense. So I'm going to save this. And so you can see I'm building a number of these out with different options. Now, as one other way, and again, this is one of my favorite parts in the system to manage some of these containers, is actually over here under Manage Top Containers, which is basically managing well, I'll show you in a second. So if I click on this, that's interesting. It actually carried over from my last browse search, so that's interesting. When you're here, you can pull up all of the containers associated with any given resource, accession, anything at a specific location in your system, or you could do a keyword. So I could search for floppy. And if I do that, it will bring up this floppy disk box, which shows me that it's clearly associated with 2 different collections. If I were to bring up my, let me clear this, bring up my Krispy Kreme and search. These are all of the containers that are associated with that particular record. And again, as before, a lot of these headers are sortable. So if I click on indicator, it now put them in the box number order. And as I scroll down, I can see that there's a floppy disk 10, and this will also show me that it's associated with 2 records. This is, yes, an oversized box of some kind, and there are other fields. If I pull up my and search for this, I've got 5, and I clearly have a number of things going on. And one of the advantages of doing this is that at this point, you can view and edit just that box record if you need to change something with it individually. Say you mistyped the number. Another thing that you can do with these are the bulk operations. And bulk operations will take effect if you just select any one record or multiple. So let's say I have these 2 boxes and I wanted to take an action on both of them. If I came in after the fact and wanted to assign a box size and declare that these were Hollingers, if I had that built out in the system, I could assign it to both of them at once. If I wanted to assign a location to these 2 boxes, say they were on the shelf together, I could assign a single location to both of them at one time, or assign locations to each of them separately. I could delete these top containers. I could merge them together. I'm going to go back and talk about merging very quickly because there is a little bit of devil in the detail on that one. But you could do it here. So if I accidentally didn't realize I already had a box 20 in the system and built a second one, I could come through, select both of the box 20s and merge them so the system would know there's only one box 20 associated with this finding aid. I'm going to bounce back over for, so this is, again, really useful part of the system. But I'm going to bounce back, and I'm going to use my browser back button. And so let's say, for example, I did make a mistake, and another meeting was actually in box 21. It was actually in box 20, and not in box 21. It was just a typo. I don't know why I did that. Okay, so it was a typo, and I want to change this to be box 20. Now, a thing that I've seen done, and that frankly we did in-house the hard way until we smartened up, was again, remember that these are records that apply to multiple places. So to do this, I could view it, and I could come in and I could edit that and say, oh, well, it's box 21 and I meant it to be box 20. I could edit that, save it. It actually opened a new window while I did this, so that's what was happening. So if I bounce back over and save this, it changed that to box 20, but it also changed the next one because I changed the overall top container. And so I changed it every place that it appeared in the system. Now here I can kind of go back in and fix it, but if you're in a 300-page finding aid that's not in box number order and you change a box number to it can be a little perilous to try and undo that. So what I should have done, and I'm going to go back and change this back again. And again, I'm just going to save this to make sure it catches that change. So I've changed it back, and it knew because it was that overall top container, when I edited it edited it back every place that it appeared. And so what I needed to do to actually change this from box 21 to box 20 was to come down to my instance and remove it. So this X, it disassociates box 21 from this particular component. Xing it does not delete the box because remember what we said yesterday that a lot of these records are siloed? So the box still exists in the back end of the system and it's still associated with the other component. But in this case, I would remove it and type in the correct box number and save that. And that changed it to be associated with the correct box and with leaving the other one in place. So that is how you would do that. I hope that makes sense. And I'm trying to leave a few minutes for questions because I know this is a complicated area.
Thanks, Nancy. Yeah, we do have some questions in the chat if you're ready for them.
Let's go.
All right. So just a clarifying thing. You're putting the word floppy in quotes for the keyword search. Is there a reason you're doing that?
Old habits. Usually if I put things in quotes, a lot of times when I'm using keyword over in, I know I did it in here. I did it over here, and I think I did it in the browse. Sometimes when I'm searching in real life, I'm searching for a little bit more of a string because I have a very complicated box number. And so for me, it's a personal habit to put it in parentheses, in quotes. But when it's just a single word like that, you don't have to. That was just my default on that. But if you are, say, in here and you do want to search for a string, didn't do that. Anyway, if it's a string, you want to put it in the parentheses, but that was just me being Anyway, I'm searching for the wrong thing. Probably spelled something wrong someplace because I never do that. So that's the trick. So for a single word, you don't.
Thanks, Nancy. Noah answered this question in depth in the Q&A, but I think it might be worth just saying it out loud for people listening. So Rebecca had a question about using instances in top containers versus just using the physical location note. So Noah pointed out, I'm just going to read his answer. So Rebecca asked, so this method is faster and more flexible and reapplicable across fonts rather than using the physical location option in the notes. So Noah said, I would say yes. Instances are designed to track physical and digital storage locations. Because each top container is a unique record in the system, it can be reused, so linked to other records. So for example, you could just relink box 12 to each record that exists in box 12 instead of having to retype box 12 multiple times in the physical location note. There's a lot of other functionality you gain by using instances and top containers, batch assigning boxes to shelf locations, etc., like Nancy just showed. Also, in my example above, if you need to move or relabel box 12, you can do that in one top container record, and then it will update all the linked records. If you use a physical location field, you'd have to update the box number or location in each archival object record independently. So I just wanted to say that out loud because I think it was a really good question and Noah answered that. I don't know, Nancy, if there's anything you want to add.
No, I think that's an excellent answer. And just to read, we'll get to this again on day 4. But the only place in the system where you can tie the system locations to a record is through the top container. So you could manually enter, as Noah was saying, you can manually enter a location someplace else, but then you have to manually update every single one of those occurrences. The one place where a location is tied to something is that tie to that top container.
All right, we have one more question and 3 minutes until break. So let's say I have items from one record that are across multiple boxes. Where is the best place to record those details about what is in each box?
So is it that what you could do here is if I'm getting the question right, you could say for any one of these entries, list multiple boxes. So I could have, in this case, I did flat file 12. I could have box 20, folder 2. I could have box 44, folder 6, and list it across that way. You could also, again, have a parent with children, and if the children were specific elements of something in different boxes, you could actually list them out that way and specifically say this part of this meeting is in this box, and so build it out more finitely. There's a lot of flexibility here in how you do that. I think part of the answer would be, how is it that you want to be able to search for, retrieve, pull stuff potentially for your reading room, and also let a reader know or a user know what all would have to be pulled to encompass the entirety of what is being described. That's probably not as specific an answer as you would ideally like, and I'm sorry.
I was going to add one thing to that. One thing that you probably don't want to do is if you have, say this another meeting file that Nancy has highlighted right now, let's say that, you know, that ran across boxes 20 to 25. Ideally, you shouldn't create a single top container that has a box range. Ideally, you should have like 5 separate top containers, you know, one for box 20, one for box 21, etc. That's just because I think the system is really designed that each top container represents like a kind of physical entity that, you know, you could barcode or move around. And if you're using if you're using ranges as top containers, it gets a little murky. The system will let you do it. It's not going to stop you from doing that. It's just kind of a best practice thing.
Yeah, Noah's right. We had a lot of ranges because they were faster to make and a lot easier. But I've spent the majority of my working from home from pandemic, not the majority, but actually a shocking amount of time, actually going through our entire database and breaking them out to be individual boxes tied to individual shelf locations, so that down the road I can actually use the space management functions that ArchivesSpace has. And without doing that, I can't use those. It doesn't, that can't handle ranges. So ranges can work. Noah's right. And if you're not using the system to track locations, it doesn't matter as much. If you don't want to use the space management functionality with an ArchivesSpace, then it really doesn't matter so much. But it's something to think through, especially if you're entering the material from scratch. If you've inherited practices with ranges, clearly those can be cleanup projects that may or may not be something you have time to engage in, which is again why the system won't stop you from doing a lot of things. And we all inherit stuff that are done in ways that we might not choose to do them now, but we still have to deal with those, and the systems have to be able to accommodate those ranges of practices.
Thanks, Errol. All right, that's all the questions in the Q&A, and we are a minute past time, so we're going to go ahead and take our break. So we are going to take a 15-minute break or 14-minute break. We're going to come back at 40 minutes after the hour, 1:40 p.m., and Noah is going to take over, showing us rapid data entry and loading via spreadsheet. So I'll see everyone after the break. All right, welcome back, everyone. It's 40 minutes after the hour, so if Noah is here, we're going to go ahead and get started with the second half of our day. Noah, are you ready?
Yep, I'm ready.
All right, let's do it.
All right, you can see the screen.
Yep.
Great. All right, so in the last section, Nancy showed you in detail how you can kind of start building out these multi-level resource records. So how you can add series and subseries, and you know how you can build out container lists and that sort of thing. And if you've had a chance to kind of play around with this, you may have realized that it can be a little tedious to do this for a lot of records in any particular collection. And so fortunately, there are a couple of ways in ArchivesSpace where you can enter in large collection inventories more efficiently. And we're gonna, for the rest of the day today, we're gonna show you a couple of those methods. So the first, those two methods are, one is called rapid data entry, and the other one is using a spreadsheet importer. And we're going to look first at rapid data entry, and then we can talk about kind of the pros and cons of each approach. So the way that you use the rapid data entry method, if you go to any given resource record, what I'm going to do is browse to, excuse me, browse to the Wayward family papers, which should be in everyone's test instance, but right here it's at the bottom. I'm going to go into edit mode. And from edit mode, you should see up here on the top of your tree view, you should see one of the options here is rapid data entry. Before I click on that, just a few things. What rapid data entry allows you to do is it allows you to add several archival object records at the same time to any particular level in the hierarchy. There are a few caveats. It will only let you add archival objects at the same level. So you won't be able to add like a series and all of its children in rapid data entry. You could only add a bunch of children to a given series, if that makes sense. So the first thing you do is kind of figure out where you want to add a bunch of records. And so what I'm going to do is kind of concoct this really simplified example. So what we're going to do is we're going to assume that this ASA Wellspring Wayward Diary series, we're going to assume that there are like 15 diaries in this series, one for each of these years. And we're going to add a record for each one of those diaries. So what I do is I click on the level of the hierarchy that I want to add children to. And then once that's highlighted, I go up to rapid data entry and I click that. And then what I see is this sort of brand new data entry form. And there's a lot of stuff going on here. So let's kind of like pause and try to break this down a little bit. And I will say before I go further with rapid data entry, I have found in my personal experience that this particular method can occasionally be a little bit buggy. And sometimes you kind of have to restart. I also find that it is not ideal when you're dealing with like hundreds or thousands of objects you want to create at one time. In my opinion, it's best for adding like a few dozen, you know, at most like 100 items to a particular level. But let's just move forward with our example. So what you see here is what I kind of call like a pseudo spreadsheet view. So what it's doing is it's taking all of the fields that are available to you for each component, and it's kind of laying them out in this spreadsheet view. And so if I scroll to the right, I can see that there are a lot of columns here. I've got columns for titles and language information, dates, extents. I've got container information, instances, and then finally all the way down here at the end, I have a bunch of kind of empty fields where I can add different notes. In most cases, you're not gonna use all of these fields like for every object that you're gonna create. Like most likely you're gonna create like a simple folder list or some other list where you're probably not gonna fill out, you know, all 33 columns for every record. So what you can do is you can kind of reduce the number of columns that show up here and choose only the ones that you want to use. You can see there's this columns drop down that tells me now that there are 33 visible columns. If I wanted to suppress some of these from this spreadsheet view, I could just start unchecking them, and then those columns are going to disappear. Just a note to be a little bit careful with this, because if you remove columns that are required, for example, like if I tried to remove, it's not going to let me remove the level of description field, but if I remove some columns that are required, it's not going to let me save this data. So you have to be a little careful. But that's kind of how you can make this template more manageable. A few other things that you can do You can also reorder the columns. So if you want, like for example, let's say I wanted the title field to show up as the first box here. I could highlight the title field, and then I could use this little up arrow to kind of move it up in the template. And then if I click apply, you'll notice that it moves the title over here. You can do that with all of the columns. Another handy thing, you can, if I highlight one field and then I like hold down my shift button and I can select like all of the date fields, for example, and move them all at the same time. And then they'll all move. Some other things that you can do in this template is you can, what else was I going to show? You can resize how large these fields are. So if you want a little bit more room, you can do that. You'll also notice that certain columns are highlighted in blue and some aren't. And then what this blue highlighting sort of indicates is what ArchivesSpace calls sticky columns. There's some documentation down here at the bottom about what sticky means, but essentially this means that for every row, if I put data in a particular row, so if I entered something like 1900 in the expression field and that column is highlighted in blue and I add another row to this, it's going to replicate the data that's in that sticky field in the next row that I create. So that's a kind of a handy feature. So rather than sort of build this out, what I've done just for expediency is another really nice thing that you can do after you've chosen the columns that you want to make visible and after you've moved the columns around in the order that you want and sort of applied your sticky functionality like you want, you can actually save these settings as a template that you can then reuse at any other time you want in the application. So if I wanted to save these settings, I could click Save Template, and I could give this template a name like Noah's, box list, and then I could save it. And then if I wanted to, if I'm in another record and I wanted to load that template up, I could do that by clicking on this Apply an Rde Template, and then choosing one of the predefined templates that I've already set up. So what I'm going to do, just so I don't run into too many errors here, I'm going to kind of cancel out of this, and then I'm going to go through this process again. So I'm going to go back to the Wayward family. I'm going to click on this diary series, and we're going to, again, pretend that we're adding like 15 diaries. I'm going to click Rapid Data Entry. And then I'm going to use a template that I have called Noah's Simple Folder List. This is one that I set up last night. So if I click on that, you'll see that it changes a lot of things in my column order here. And if I scroll, you can see that I only have just a few columns visible. So let's say this is a really simple list of diaries that I want to add to this series. And I'll show you how you could kind of build that out here. So what I can do is I can fill out the first row. So I can say my level of description here, I want to be file. These are file level entries. Instance type, which is a required field, as Nancy mentioned. I'm just going to set that to mixed materials for everything. And then here, I can indicate which top container this diary is housed in. And so if a top container didn't yet exist, you could create one from here. But because one already exists, box one, we're just going to add all these to box one. I can just type the number 1, and I'm going to see kind of this autocomplete that looks up all of the containers in this collection that have 1 in them. And then I'm just going to select box 1. And then let's say that each one of these diaries is in a separate folder. This is a nice and tidy collection. So we'll say that this one is in folder 1. For the title of this thing, we can say it's just a diary. Let's see what else we've got here. We can provide a date expression. I think these diaries began at 1847. So we'll say the first diary is just dated 1847. And that is an inclusive date. And I'm using the date label of creation just to note that these are creation dates. So now what I can do, and fingers crossed that this actually works, I can add 14 more rows. And what happens is ArchivesSpace is going to fill down kind of all of the information that I set in that first row, especially in cases where the column was highlighted blue, it was marked as sticky. I've run into a small little bug over here where it's kind of gotten my columns a little out of whack, but let's just power through with this example and see if it works. Some other things you can do. So in this child indicator field, if I want to say that each one of these diaries is in a different folder, what I can do is I can apply like a sequence to this column. And the way I do that is I go to this fill column button at the top. I click that. And there are two different ways that you can fill values in a column. You can either fill the same value in every row, in which case you would use this basic option, and then you would type in what value you wanted, or you can use the sequence option. So in this case, we're going to use the sequence option. So I highlighted this sequence tab, and then I choose the column that I want to use. So if I go to the child indicator, instance child indicator column, that's the one that I want to fill. And I can say start at number 1 and go to folder 15. So what this is saying is like, I want to increment the number 1 each row. And so I want to start at 1 and end at 15. And if I just want a kind of sanity check of that, I can click this preview sequenced values button, and it'll just tell me like, this is what you're going to do if you click apply sequence. So if I click apply sequence, you'll see here in the child indicator column that it's filled these folder numbers down nicely all the way to the end of my sheet. Similarly, you can do the same kind of fill operation in the date field. You'll notice somehow my columns have gotten wacky here. So I'm going to see what happens if I just try to save this without making any more changes. Yeah, and you'll see here what happened is it took the data that I had in that rapid data entry screen, and for each row, it created a new child record. Unfortunately, these all have the same date. Normally, I would want to increment this date or provide a unique date value for each one of these just because they're different. But that is essentially how rapid data entry works. We can try to do another example real quick because we have a little bit of time and see if we can get through one without having an error. So I'm going to go to I'm going to go to my Krispy Kreme record. And I'm going to go to this assorted donuts series. And let's say I want to add some records for donuts. So I can choose my simple folder list again. I can say these are all in box 1. Start at folder 1. Let's say these are all chocolate. if I add, I'm going to add 20 rows here. Okay. And then let's say I want to fill these folders like I just did before, these folder numbers. So I'm going to go to fill. I'm going to go to sequence. And I'm going to choose the child indicator column. Start at 1. Let's end at 20. Apply that. Oops. This is instructive. It tells me that I've got more rows than there are numbers in my sequence. So if I click preview, it tells me I've got 21 rows, but I only gave it 20 values. So I'm going to give it one more. Preview that. So now I've got folders 1 to 21, and now I'm going to apply that. And you'll see that it filled down my folder numbers. And if we do the same thing with dates, or I'll show you how to fill the same value down. So say let's say these are all chocolate donuts. So we're going to fill the value chocolate down for every cell. So if I go to fill and I choose the title column, I choose this basic option over here, this basic tab, and I choose the title column. And here, if I type in the value chocolate, what I'm saying is I want every row in this sheet to have the value chocolate. I apply that, and you can see how it fills it down every row. And then if I want to increment the dates just for fun, I can do that. Fill column, sequence, date expression. And then we could say start at 1905 and end at 19, I can't remember how many rows I had, but 26, something like that. Yeah, for 21 rows, the 21 sequence values are, and it shows me all of the dates that I'm going to apply. If that looks good to me, I click apply sequence, and then you can see how the dates will increment here. So that's generally how this works. I can keep adding rows if I want. A few things to point out. One thing that you can do is you can validate all of this data before you save them. And there's a validate button down here. If I click validate, it's going to just check to make sure I have all the required fields and that the data in those fields is formatted as the system expects. And it'll give me this green message that tells me all rows are valid up here. If there's an error, it'll have a red message here, and then it'll have kind of specific error messages next to each row where there's a problem. Let's see. So if I want to go ahead and save these rows, I can do that. And then when I click save, what it's doing is it's just going in the background and it's adding them all as children of this assorted donut series. And here you can see them. And so if I click on any given one of these, you can see that the data appears, in all of the fields that Nancy was showing you earlier. So the title field is filled out. We've got this date subrecord with a date expression. And down in the instances section, we've got this linked to box 1, top container, and then we have folder 1. So this is just a much more efficient way of entering in a lot of items all at the same level. And again, if you plan on using this a lot, a nice way to sort of work with it is think about what your most common data entry scenarios are, and you can develop kind of specialized templates for each one of those scenarios. So at least at Duke, in our case, we have like a simple folder list template, and then we have like a box list one that's even more basic. And then we just tend to reuse those over and over again. A little word of warning, if you are spending a lot of time working in this RDE screen, and let's say you've got like 100 rows filled out, and then for some reason you walk away and you don't save it, or you kind of accidentally navigate away, use your back button or something, you could potentially lose all of the data that you have in this rapid data entry area if you don't save it. I know they've added a few safeguards to make it harder to lose that data in recent versions, but just know that that is something that can happen. So that is the rapid data entry method. Let's take a look. Let's go ahead and move on to the loading via spreadsheet method, which I find to be a lot more efficient and a lot more usable. So if I go back to my home screen, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to find a different resource record. I've kind of mocked up this Noah's Ark test collection record here. I'm going to go into edit mode. And what you'll see here is this is a resource record that only has a top level record. It doesn't have any, lower level components or archival objects. There's no series, there's no files, there's no container information. It's only this top level resource record. So what you can do with the load via spreadsheet method is you can provide your entire hierarchy in a spreadsheet that you then load into a resource record. And one of the benefits of using the spreadsheet method is over the rapid data entry method is with the spreadsheets, you can add you can add multiple levels of hierarchy all at the same time. So when we looked at RDE, we could only add like siblings at the same time. But with the spreadsheet method, you can load in series and subseries and files all at the same time. You can also add linked digital objects and linked agent and subject records all at the same time. That's not something you can do in the rapid data entry template. Another sort of benefit of using the spreadsheet method is more from a workflow perspective. So I really like the spreadsheet method because you can kind of work in the spreadsheet outside of ArchivesSpace. You can be offline. You can be doing it, wherever you want. You can do it in Google Sheets or share it with a student or something like that. And you can kind of do all of your work. And then when you're sort of finally ready to commit it to ArchivesSpace, you can add it all at once. Another benefit is just you can take advantage of all of the affordances you get with the spreadsheet. So you can do things like sort your data. You can run, a spell checker across your spreadsheet if you want to look for spelling errors, that sort of thing. And those aren't really things that you can do in RDE or within ArchivesSpace itself. So let's, I'm not going to build out a whole example, but I'm just going to load a spreadsheet that I've already created just to show you how this works. And so you'll notice when I'm at a collection level record and a resource record, and I have that highlighted, there's a load via spreadsheet button up here. If I click that, it's going to ask me to go sort of find a spreadsheet file. And now I can't just load any old spreadsheet that I've created. The spreadsheet has to conform to a very specific template. And so before I do this, I'm going to actually show you what that template looks like. So I have an Excel spreadsheet that I've already created. I'll walk through a little bit of this here in a minute, but this is what the template looks like. If you want to download this template and use it, you can find it in the ArchivesSpace Help Center. So if I click anywhere on these question marks in the application, I just opened up the Help Center in a new tab. If I go to the user manual, and then I go down to this section on importing and exporting data. And then further down, there's a section here called Import Archival Objects from Excel or CSV. If I click that, This is going to give you like extensive documentation about how this spreadsheet import method works. We can't go over all of this in the workshop today, but you'll also find here links to where you can download these spreadsheet templates. And then it'll give you information about, which columns are required and then how to structure your data, et cetera, et cetera. There have been some changes to the way this works in various versions of ArchivesSpace, but I think this documentation is still pretty accurate and should be valid. So let's go back to my spreadsheet template. And I'll sort of walk through how this template works in a nutshell. So you'll see that there are like 5 header rows here. And each one of these header rows gives you a little bit of information about each particular field. This row number 4 is one that you can't touch. So don't try to delete this row and don't change the values in this row, because this is how ArchivesSpace knows to assign data in this column to a particular field in ArchivesSpace. Some of these other header rows give you like some more information about how to format data in that column. You'll also notice that there are some rows here that are highlighted in red. Anything that you see in red in the template is a required field, or it's sort of conditionally required if you're going to provide that kind of information. So for example, if I'm going to provide an extent statement, I have to provide both an extent number and an extent type. Again, there's a lot of stuff going on with this spreadsheet template, but just a few of the really important things to point out. One of the requirements for using the template is that each row has to have this EADID value filled out. And this EADID value has to correspond to the EADID field, to the value in the EADID field in my resource record. So here I'm in the resource record in the Finding a Data section, and my EADID field value is Noah's Ark. And so if I want to use this template, I've got to make sure I have that value in every row of this sheet. This title field is kind of self-explanatory. That's where you put whatever title of the component you want to add. But let me move over here to this hierarchical relationship, column, these columns right here. So in this column, this is where you communicate at what kind of level in the hierarchy each row is going to be created. So I tried to mock up an example that has some sort of semantic meaning in itself. So what I've got here is I've got a series that's called animals, and I've got that marked with the number 1, which means that that is going to be sort of the first level of object that I add. In the second row, I've got mammals. Mammals are sort of subordinate to animals, and I've got them with the number 2 here, meaning that when I add this row, it is going to be added as a child of animals. And then in this other descriptive level column, I've kind of indicated the level of description. And this is a drop-down field that has values that correspond to the values that are already in the ArchivesSpace level of description field. So if I just scroll down here kind of quickly, you'll see that I've got a series, I've got subseries, and then I've got 4 files. I've got whales, monkeys, squirrels, and rats, and they're all file level entries that are all siblings that are children of the mammals series. So all of these are marked with a 3. And then we have another subseries for reptiles, so that's a 2. We have snakes, a 3. And then, and this is kind of a strained example, but just to show you that if we can add as much hierarchy as we want using the spreadsheet template. So I've got a bunch of turtles, and then all of these turtles are sort of one level lower than the one before it in the spreadsheet. And then if I keep scrolling down, at the very end, you'll see I just have this huge flat list of like miscellaneous humans. And these are all marked with a 3, and they're all files. So in total, I've got 200 rows in this spreadsheet. And I want to add all 200 of these rows at the same time. Just to show you a couple other things real quickly. If I scroll to the right, you'll see I've provided some date information here for a few of these rows. I provided some extent information. The spreadsheet tries to do a decent job of color coding the different areas of data that you might have. So you can see extent info is all in green, and then there's another color when we get to container information, the set of columns that pertain to containers. And here you can see I've assigned box and folder numbers to some of these rows. And again, this is really nice because you can just use, the drag down features in Excel to increment your box numbers if you're working in this spreadsheet template. If I keep scrolling over, you'll see there are some columns for digital object information. We'll talk about digital objects in more detail next Tuesday, but I mocked up an example of how you could add a digital object and a link to that object in the spreadsheet. And then we have agent information. So if I wanted to link names to each one of these objects, I could, corporate names, subjects, etc. And then at the very end of the spreadsheet, we have all of the various note fields that are available to you. So we've got some restriction notes, abstract notes, arrangement note, et cetera, et cetera. There are a lot of columns. So just know that pretty much any data that you want to add to a record, you can do through the spreadsheet method. One thing you can do is I believe you can delete or hide columns if you don't want to use all of these. The only thing you can't do is change the names of these column headers. So if you want to create your own kind of pared down version of the spreadsheet template that you want to reuse, you can do that. That's something that we've done. So let's assume we've finished our template. We're all done with it. We save it. Now what we do from within ArchivesSpace, we're back at this resource record that has an EAD ID field that matches what we've defined in our spreadsheet. Then we click the Load via Spreadsheet button, and then we click Select File. We go and find that file, wherever it is on our system. Mine is just kind of sitting here on my desktop. So I'm going to click on it, click Open. Before I actually import it, a couple other things to cover. The template I showed you is the one that you can use for importing archival objects. There's another template altogether that you can use for adding digital objects to existing archival objects. We're not going to cover that in the workshop, but there is documentation about how that spreadsheet import would work in the Help Center as well. Last thing, there is an option to validate your data before you actually import it. So if I click this field and I clicked import, what it would actually do is it would just read over that spreadsheet and make sure that I'm not missing any required data, or I don't have data that doesn't conform to some of the validation rules in ArchivesSpace. This can be a really handy thing to do if you're working with a really large spreadsheet. It will give you a kind of row by row report of whether or not your data validates. I'm just going to go ahead and import this. And then what happens when I click import, and this is a somewhat new feature in this version of ArchivesSpace, is it's going to jump me over here to this background jobs area. And then down here, I'm going to get this kind of log readout of the activity that's happening right now. So it's telling me it's processing each row, it's creating archival objects, it's creating top containers, et cetera, et cetera. If you run into errors, it will report errors to you in this log. Sometimes those errors are intelligible and sometimes they're not. If the job finishes successfully, you'll get this sort of green message here on the left that tells you the job is completed. And then you can click refresh page. And then what it'll do, down here, it'll show you just like all of the objects that it added. This isn't super helpful, but if you click on any one of these, what it's going to do is it's going to jump you back to the resource record. So if now that I'm back in this resource record, you can see that it added my animal series and my human series. If I drill down, you can see I've got my mammals and reptiles. You can see it added the container information that I included. This particular row I had added a digital object to, and so you can see the digital object was added. You can see that digital object down here. It actually creates a digital object record in the digital objects module, which we'll talk about Tuesday, but a handy feature. Just to show you the kind of turtles all the way down thing, you can create as much hierarchy as you want. So if you remember from my spreadsheet, I had just incremented these hierarchical relationship values here. And that's why when I imported them, they're all sort of children of each other. This is, obviously something you probably don't want to do in practice, but just to show you how it works. And then finally, at the very bottom, I have all of my miscellaneous humans. I've got dates for those, and then I've got, all my box numbers for those. And if I were to open up any one of these given records, if I click on the animal series, you can see that it's bringing in the note fields, the abstract note that I had at that level, restriction notes, some animals can't be handled safely, et cetera, et cetera. So again, this is just a really, really efficient and powerful way to add description very quickly in ArchivesSpace. We use it all the time at Duke. It's honestly the primary way that we create collection inventories, especially for large collections. So I highly encourage you to test it out and use it if that is a use case that you have. And I know I've run a little bit over time, but I'm happy to take questions on this because there are a lot of things I probably glossed over.
Thanks, Noah. Yeah, this is definitely hands down the most popular feature in ArchivesSpace. So I definitely recommend playing around with it and testing it out. We do have one question, Noah. Can you add more than one spreadsheet to a resource, such as proceeding series by series, rather than doing the whole collection in one?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, you can do that. And that's often how we work. So let's say I wanted to, in this example, like let's say I wanted to add another series and call it, I don't know, birds or something. And then, oops, I missed my level of description. You can add you can load data from a spreadsheet into any level. So you can kind of incrementally build your resource record. So if I highlight birds and then I click load via spreadsheet, I can load children, or I can load an entire hierarchy into the birds subseries. One thing to be a little bit mindful when you're doing that is there are some subtle quirks to how the the hierarchical relationship field should work. And those are kind of explained here in this header. So just kind of be aware of that. But yeah, that's how we work. We often will have like different students, for example, working on different series simultaneously and kind of working on spreadsheets for those. And then we can kind of add those at different times as folks finish their work on those series.
Thanks, Noah. Is there ever an instance where the validation job fails? I've used the load via spreadsheet several times, and then when errors are flagged in the validation, which I find using Control F, the job still completes and everything is green. Is there a better way to see validation errors?
That's a good question. Let's see if we can mock something up. The template actually does a good job of not letting you do kind of awful things. But I think it's too involved to get into this. But one thing I will say is that when you select the only validate option, it should go row by row. And if there's a problem in row 14, it'll say like error with row 14. And then you know to go back and like look at that row and fix it. If you actually tried to commit the whole job without fixing that row, if I'm remembering right, what will happen is it will add all of the other rows except for the rows that have validation errors. And so that is, in most cases, probably not the behavior that you want. And so I definitely recommend using the validation option before you try to add objects. Is that, I feel like I partially answered that question.
And I will point out that in your course materials packet on the Google Drive, there is the template is there, and the Noah's Ark example is provided. So what he just showed and demonstrated, if you want to try that for yourself with data that's already been created and we know works because we just saw Noah do it, that's in your distribution packet. So you can do that as well. I really like this example because I like hearing random comments like, I have a lot of turtles and here are my miscellaneous humans when people are talking about ArchivesSpace.
Nice. I should have made a record for everyone in the workshop.
No, don't ever do that.
Yeah.
We have 6 more minutes. There are no questions coming in the Q&A. There's some questions about accessing the Help Center. So I'll just briefly go over, if you are an ArchivesSpace member, you do, as one of your member benefits, have access to our Help Center. The Help Center contains our user manual and user tutorial videos. The videos are great. They are created by the training team, so people on the training core like Nancy and Noah. And there's a lot of extensive information about how to use the spreadsheet importer there. There's also information on how to use a spreadsheet importer in your workbook. So if you are not an ArchivesSpace member and don't have access to the workbook, there is some documentation, to the Help Center, there is some documentation in your workbook about that. You can also find the spreadsheet template either through the Help Center, like Noah demonstrated, or via the migration tools and data maps page on our website, which is linked in your agenda. So there are a couple different ways to get to that template if you'd like to make use of it. I'm not seeing any other questions coming through the chat or the Q&A. Nancy, there was a question that came to the panelists that I think you were going to maybe elaborate on.
Yeah. So there was one, I think I flubbed the response because I think I sent the response to the panelists as opposed to like everybody. When Noah was doing the rapid data entry, especially the second example, he selected a box, and the way the box looked was box 1, and then it had a series 1 and a series 2 following it. And the question was, well, why does it look like that? And that's because the record, the top container was trying to indicate that the particular box in question was actually being used in both series 1 and series 2. And we see that a lot. And for the most part, that's really irritating to see, but there's a reason why that happens. And it goes back to, I think, again, I mentioned earlier that there are a variety of descriptive practices that ArchivesSpace has to accommodate. And one of these really came up when they were actually transferring from Archivist Toolkit to ArchivesSpace. And they realized that it had been maybe more common, especially in early years of processing, than one had thought, that some organizations, just when they were writing finding aids, they started renumbering their boxes at each series. So series 1 had boxes 1 through 10, and series 2 had boxes 1 through 10. And they had to find a way to distinguish box 1 from each other, even within a finding aid, as opposed to those boxes that showed up in multiple series across a finding aid. So that's why when you sometimes pull up a box record, when it displays and you're selecting it, it was giving people the option of, do you want the box 1 that is used here or the box 1 that is used there? And because, again, data with that problem ended up getting loaded into the system because the cleanup on it was beyond people's ability to do, there's holdovers from that in the system. So that's why you're seeing that. In this case, it's just a single box 1. It just happens to be used in both, and the system is telling you that. But it's still safe to choose that, especially if you know that in your own descriptive practices, each finding aid only has a single, box 1. I don't know if does that help explain that question?
To add a little bit more to what Nancy said, those series labels that show up on boxes, on top containers, is directly related to if you have a series like this animal series and it has a component unique identifier, we can call this like series blah blah whatever 1. And if I save that, then if I go and I look at all of the top containers that exist in the Noah's Ark collection, it's not showing it. It might take a while for these to index, but yeah. So these boxes here are both used in that series. And so that's why when you're looking up a top container or when you're viewing a top container, it says like series, whatever you type in that component unique identifier level at that series. It's a little bit confusing and kind of messy, admittedly, in the interface, but that's what's going on. So if I wanted this information to go away, this series stuff to go away, what I could do is I could just go back to that Noah's Ark collection and that animal series, and I could just remove this data, and then it'll disappear from the top container records. So that's kind of like practically where the data is coming from. Yeah.
Thanks, Nancy and Noah. All right, we are at time. And I'm not seeing any questions coming in the Q&A, so we're going to go ahead and wrap up. Any last thoughts from Nancy or Noah?
I don't think so.
Thank you, everyone, for a great second day. There is another exercise for you to complete before we meet again next Tuesday. It's only one this time, and that's on page 68 of your workbook. It's to create a multi-level resource record and to make use of the rapid data entry tool. That's the only exercise that we've built out for you to complete. But if you'd also like to try to use the load via spreadsheet tool and take that spreadsheet that Noah has created and try it in your own test instance, please feel free to give that a whirl and see how it goes. And don't forget, we do have that homework feedback form available. So if you do have any questions when you're doing your assignments, if you could just drop them there, it helps us sort of prep to answer those questions. But with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up. I hope everyone has a nice weekend, and I look forward to seeing you on Tuesday. Bye, everyone.